Welcome, everybody, to our panel discussion entitled Artificial Intelligence-Powered Cancer Diagnostics: How Regulatory Science Can Reshape Digital Diagnostics. My name is Joe Leonards, and I'm very happy to be the host of today's session. Biopsies are still mostly read under a microscope, typically by a human pathologist. The diagnostic process can be painstaking or considered an endeavor, and often renders an up or down opinion. For example, cancer or no cancer. Digitizing this work would not only speed up processing, but could be coupled with some of the modern tools of artificial intelligence or machine learning, and might ultimately give a completely different view of this process and actually lead to more accurate information. Before we move to the panel discussion, I wanted to thank the entire leadership of MDIC for orchestrating this event and giving us the opportunity to present what we do. Most importantly, I would also wanted to thank you for taking the time. So there's an unconventional new model that enables a lot of stakeholders to provide input into regulatory decision-making. It is manifesting in several new programs in the agency. For example, there's the Center for Digital Health, there's a network of experts, there's collaborative communities, and it's my absolute distinct pleasure to have the director of the Office of Science and Engineering at the FDA, Ed Magirison, here with us today. Ed, thanks a lot for taking the time. Would you mind explaining?
My pleasure, Joe.
Would you mind explaining the intent and vision of this network of expert and this actively reaching out from the agency, and what are you trying or hoping to achieve with that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you and also MDIC as well for the opportunity. We're very excited and thrilled to be a member of all of the collaborative communities that we currently are a member of. There are about 10 at this point, and that's growing quite a lot. So I'd like to kind of address it in a general sense and then drill down a little bit more into some specifics. I think it should help explain it. Clearly, collaboration in the pre-market space makes an awful lot of sense. I'm particularly interested in this. I've been at the agency for a while, and I've worked in industry as well. And I think one of the things that particularly interests me is how do we really accelerate upstream innovation in this space and others? And I think this is one vehicle we've got for doing that. Very broadly, collaborative communities are very much what they sound like. They're a community. They're not led by FDA. They're not convened by FDA. For PICC, of course, MDIC have taken on that role, and we're very thankful for them to doing that. The collaboratives are not there specifically to advise FDA. Clearly, we want them to be open for everybody to join if they so wish. But I think it's a way that we can really look at regulatory science and use it to the benefit of technology development. And I'm a firm believer that if we can put a technology development on a firm footing, it's much easier to spin out multiple really good products from that fundamentally strong technology, which is really going to be for the benefit of patients. And I think this whole area of digital pathology is a classic example of that. We're really at the start of a long journey. To date, there are 2 systems on the market in the USA. We expect that to increase massively. And it's a technology that's a little bit like an octopus. It's got so many different arms and strands to it. It involves AI. It involves being able to understand color and different staining, and the problems go on and on. This is a journey for a technology. We're at the start of it, and it clearly makes sense for us to take that journey together as a medtech community. So a little more specifically, we've seen many times in the past that as a technology is developing, the scientific methods for evaluating the safety and effectiveness of the technology aren't in synchronization with that. They lag behind. And that's kind of the thing that keeps me awake at night as director of OCEL. The last thing we want at FDA is for someone to come knocking at the door and say, we've got a marvelous product. And for us to say, that's great, we don't know what questions to ask you. That's not an acceptable position for us to be in. And that's really why we want to be right at the heart of all of these efforts and helping where we can. The fundamental product that I see coming out of this regulatory science are a variety of methods, tools, data sets that can be used in a pre-competitive way to really drive the technology forward for everybody. If you imagine, for example, 10 separate companies involved in the development of a digital pathology system, then we really want them to focus on how good the product will be for patients, not how well it's tested. So the more that we can standardize these approaches, I think the benefit will be in getting a robust technology which can develop, and then we'll all see the benefits of that over time. So specifically, we're looking for regulatory science tools to come out of these sorts of collaborations. That will help the research that we do internally within CDRH. And a lot of that we're now making much more public through the website, and we now have published well over 100 regulatory science tools. And then we firmly believe that as a technology becomes more established, some of those tools will kind of grow up to be fully qualified medical device development tools, which are much, much more sort of regulatorily robust for the process of clearance or approval when it gets that far. So fundamentally, we're looking to really standardize a lot of the thought process, make sure that we're part of the journey as technology develops, and I think we'll get better products out at the end of it.
That's a perfect transition. The products that we're talking about ultimately affect cancer diagnostics. So thank you very much, Ed, for outlining this very, very large and extensive scope. And I know it affects other areas, but we wanted to talk about cancer diagnostics. And it's my pleasure to have Matthew Hanna on the panel. Matthew is a pathologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He's the director of the Digital Pathology Informatics program with a very, very strong subspecialty interest in IT and application of machine learning technologies. He has published extensively in the field of digital pathology, and it's a pleasure having you, Matthew. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me and for providing this stage to discuss, obviously, these very important and timely topics. Machine learning and artificial intelligence in pathology has rapidly grown over the last several years, and the respective potential of transforming our medical domain is very apparent. So I typically place these potential areas of where impact can happen in the field in three buckets. The first is an increase in accuracy, where the thought is that if a deep learning model is trained on expert data, those potentially in underserved areas may benefit from having a model output for a specific diagnostic classification. The second area is really an increase in efficiency or potential cost effectiveness for these assistive technologies being used clinically. With the continual increase in patients seeking healthcare and incremental increase in pathology volume that is being reviewed, coupling that with a decline in pathologist workforce that's expected on the horizon, pathologists would definitely need, or would be keen to have a high quality assistive models to help prioritize their workloads or assist in routine detection, classification, or quantification tasks. And so the third bin is related to discovery. So I find this to be the most exciting. There's potential for novel digital biomarkers to hopefully provide innovative insights toward patient diagnosis and potentially prognostication. There's been extensive clinical translational evidence for the current cancer grading schema and staging guidelines that place patients in a decision tree based on the existing current standards of care. However, there's definitely a potential trove of untapped multimodal data that can be mined and hopefully output insightful and meaningful information that can be used to diagnose, manage, and treat patients differently from how medicine's practiced today. I also don't think this is an easy road ahead of us. We can't be naive to believe that this will all be that machine learning and AI will solve all of the challenges in medicine. The practice of medicine has always been said to be a mix of science and art, but hopefully machine learning can be helpful in some of these low-hanging fruit areas, but also continue to evolve in overcoming certain higher level obstacles. For instance, model generalizability is a concept, and model generalizability is one area in the pathology community has relatively low data to be working with. And so I think we do need robust studies evaluating how models perform based on being trained on local site data versus being trained on different permutations of aggregated data from multiple sites. Similarly, pathology has an extensive list of tumor types, morphologies, variants, etc. Machine learning models should be trained on as various data set as the intended task is needed to infer. So I think it would be helpful for these machine learning models to let pathologists know their given operating point, to know how sensitive or specific the model is, and also to know what inclusion and exclusion criteria that the model was able to compute. For instance, if a breast cancer classifier was trained on a given data set from a country maybe where a certain tumor is underrepresented, and then that model is deployed at a hospital where that cancer subtype is very prevalent, it's likely that model will not classify that specific tumor subtype. So the pathologist should at least know what the model can, and maybe more importantly, what the model cannot do. And so I think understanding this generalizability will hopefully become much more apparent in the coming years, especially working with all the various stakeholders. And I think this also applies to racial or other biases that may exist in these trained data sets. So really the first step is, at least I think, identifying these different data points where biases may be prevalent, and then uncovering each new layer with larger multi-center studies, and in order to make sure that we're keeping quality patient care at the forefront of the tools that are available in clinical use. And I'll also say, I guess, one of the last areas of interest that hopefully I'll have time to discuss today is explainability. And there's a lot of debates over this topic where some users want full transparency into a model with extensive introspective studies versus other kind of hand waving, saying it may not be so important. And to the latter's point, especially in medicine, there are several examples where we have innovations and technologies that we still don't really fully understand how they work and where they are routinely in practice. I've heard the example for electroconvulsive therapy, where we actually pass electric currents through a person's brain, and we're intentionally triggering a seizure, which seemingly changed the brain chemistry output to treat depression and other diseases. But we know it works. There are extensive studies that shows it works without necessarily explaining the exact underpinnings of how. And so I think this is very relatable, where we need to create robust methods and standards for how all of the organizations that need to be actually building these models, so that we don't have to worry about how those are tested, but we can work on essentially showing that they do improve patient cares or have better outcomes and meaningful interventions. And so I think it is important for physicians to understand how these diagnostic findings relate to the patient, and put all of the pieces together.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me ask you a quick question. Would you trust a machine learning algorithm, or would you want to take a look at it?
So I think there is a curve of trust, if you will, a trust curve that will likely be needed. And I think there are ways of showing, there are metrics that can be used to view the potential performance of a machine learning model based on its training data and its operating point, and looking at sensitivity, specificities, etc. And I think understanding the data that the model was trained on also has a lot of implications for how for how that model will perform at a deployment site. So yes, I think trust can be gained from a machine learning model. I will say, as with any new technology, I think with use, the understandings and trust will come and be evident. And I think, with that said, I do think trust is not necessarily, it's not necessarily related to regulatory clearances in that sense, but from a clinical perspective, yes, I do think there is a trust curve. But I think all of these terms, generalizability, explainability, etc., the mechanistic proof that that, you know, in terms of having the burden on the machine learning model and looking at their outputs, you know, I can only speak to the end user's perspective as the pathologist, where I think there will be a trust curve, and based on the performance of the model, especially at that local site, maybe you know, steep or otherwise, in terms of how it performs. But I think in terms of how the government clears or approves or qualifies certain models is based, you know, they're putting the burden on ensuring that the clearing organization or whoever is looking to seek clearance for a specific product or device is showing appropriate quality and evidence that supports whatever their intended use claims are.
Thank you, thank you. I think that's probably one of the toughest questions, and I know with your background that is fundamentally based on data. I want to move on to Marcus Herman. He's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, director of computational pathology, and the co-chair of the DICOM Working Group 26. Marcus, thank you. Now, given the importance of data integration, as we just heard from Matthew, what do you see as sort of the key hurdles for achieving interoperability of all these systems that have to work in unison? Marcus?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think I really want to pick up of where Matthew left off. I think he beautifully summarized the potential and the use cases for ML models in clinical practice, but also touched upon some of the challenges related to evaluation of these models and building trust when using them. And I think one aspect that is often forgotten kind of is that a model doesn't exist in isolation, but it's ultimately a software system, or it needs to be embedded into a software system that then gets employed into a larger environment. So when we look at digital imaging or digital pathology as a whole, we have a variety of different systems that exist. So there's an image acquisition device, which scans the images and saves them to a file. We typically have an image management system where these data will be stored and where they can be retrieved from over network, where we can also query that to search for specific types of images. Then we have an image display system where the image data is being visualized to pathologists, where they can interpret the actual images. And then we may have an ML system somewhere that probably also needs to get the data from some kind of image management system. And that is then one of these problems where that we typically encounter if we now want to evaluate a model, not just in a research setting where we may initially compile a data set specifically for that purpose. We get this into a format that the model can read. But now really we have a medical device that we want to use in clinical practice that can interoperate with some of the other systems that I just mentioned. Then we get into a lot of technical challenges there. And the word that is often being used here is interoperability. So maybe first I'll explain a little bit what I understand by interoperability and what some of the consequences are. So when we talk about interoperability, we generally mean the ability of two or more systems to exchange information, but also to be able to interpret and use the exchange information. So there are two aspects. One is kind of like just the exchange of information, which we typically refer to as structural interoperability. But then there is the other part where we need to be able to interpret and use that information in clinical context. So the semantic interoperability. And that is really, I think, where we need to put a lot more emphasis on. So for example, Joe, at the beginning, I think you said, one of the key questions may be cancer versus no cancer. And Matthew already alluded to that often it's it's more intricate than just that of like whether there is cancer or not cancer. There are like hundreds of different tumor types that we may want to distinguish, some of them benign, some of them malignant. For some of them are very specific treatments available. And so often when we then want to use a model, we'll need to consider the use of that model as part of the intended use. So concretely, we may have a model, for example, that would detect and maybe quantify tumor cells that are positive for PD-L1. And we may only want to use this in like lung cancer tissue sections that were formalin fixed, paraffin embedded, and stained with a particular antibody clone. So if we now consider having a model for this in like a clinical workflow, we would first need to get the images into the model. The model needs to be able to interpret these images, potentially make the decision of whether the image is even appropriate to analyze, like whether that is an FFPE H&E stained tissue section, render a prediction, but ultimately also return that prediction in a way so that this result can included into a clinical workflow, stored in a storage system, communicated via an image management system that is available at the site, and displayed back to an end user. And so what we see at the moment is that a lot of the companies that we now interact with that would like sell such an ML model, that they would typically bring the entire system. Like they would manage the images, they would have a dedicated viewer for this, and so forth. So when we talk about evaluating a model, we typically need to talk about evaluating an entire system in its entirety, or we really need to be able to integrate just that model within all of the other components that we're dealing with. I think, and one of the challenges that we often realize is that a lot of these models get developed in a research setting, but then this transition into a medical device or incorporating them into in a clinical environment is a major challenge. And so this gap between development in a research setting on the one hand side and clinical use for a very specific intended use case on the other hand is something that is currently rarely bridged. And so one of the things that we are working on in the standards working group is how can we encode both the images but also image annotations or image measurements and analysis results in a way that they can be consumed by the model as an input, but also that the outputs that are generated by a model can be interpreted and used by other systems and pathologists, including complexities like specifying exactly what type of tumor was detected, the morphology, the topography, and all the complexity that a pathologist needs to deal with in a clinical context, and having the information that is required for unambiguous interpretation.
Perfect. Do you mind explaining whether there are any incentives currently to achieve interoperability other than, let's say, from users?
Yeah, I think that there is a shift in the industry. What we've seen initially is that we really had so-called whole slide imaging systems that would incorporate the acquisition device, the image management, and the image display. And for just visualizing images and for pathologists to visually review the images, that didn't create such a huge challenge. But now that we face basically algorithm developers will also face the challenge, how do they ultimately integrate their model into a clinical workflow without having to build an image management system and a display system and all of that. So I think there is a dynamic now in the market where also the vendors themselves have an interest to not have to provide everything along the entire pixel pathway just to deliver their actual product, but so that they can basically develop models that would plug and play, where they would have the ability to just deploy a model, consume the data from, I don't know, an image management system of another vendor, and also return the outputs and have them displayed on a viewer that a hospital may already have. So I think initially a lot of the pull or the push for standardization came from the users, but I think now there's also increasingly an interest within the industry to have products that are interoperable and be able to exchange information. I think AI and ML is a huge driver in that process.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marcus. I transition over to Laura Lassiter. She is the Senior Director for Policy and Research at Pharma and has previously been the Director of Health Policy at Friends of Cancer Research, which is a cancer patient advocacy group in DC. She has been our patient advocacy representative and very active in the PICC working group for payer strategies, and it's fantastic having you. Laura, as part of the digital revolution and the 21st Century Cures Act, patients have gained, and some may say rightfully so, more insights into their electronic medical record. Now, since we're talking about digitization, it's totally, conceivable that this will become all part of the medical record. Would you mind outlining briefly how you see the patient perspective represented in this totally changing environment of digital diagnostics?
Thanks, Joe. I'm really happy to be here on behalf of Friends of Cancer Research and talk about this really important topic. And I appreciate the question. I think it's a particularly insightful question because it highlights the active role that patients are taking in two aspects. First being their own healthcare. As you mentioned, 21st century cures, patients are having increased access to their own healthcare information. And that highlights just how important it is that we think about, now that patients have more and more access and more rapid access to information that is created from these really technical, high complex techniques and diagnoses, is how do we convey that information to patients in a way that's understandable and usable from the patient perspective. And the second aspect is in healthcare, the healthcare field in general. You know, patients are no longer satisfied with being, being on the sidelines and cheering on medical research, but want to be actively integrated into the entire process and the medical, the ecosystem. And we see this now in many aspects. More patient groups are taking charge of registries and biobanks and facilitating accelerators in early drug development, all the way to having active presence in advocacy to Congress on legislation like 21st Century Cures, like the user fee acts for FDA. And so we're seeing greater emphasis on the patient priorities in medical research. So why is the collaborative community so important? Well, it is, in fact, it's due to that collaborative nature, which is what makes it so impactful, I think, for a patient and in the field in general. And so, I think it was Ed that brought up, the importance of having this collaborative community in the pre-competitive space, because it's not just about a single, developing a single product, but it's about developing the field, ensuring that digitization of, of samples and the further integration of AI into diagnoses is being done in a way that brings in all aspects, and particularly the patient aspect. The importance here is that patients can not only help to direct, but also facilitate that research, as I mentioned, other things that patient groups are doing. And so it's more of a lot of the efforts that we are seeing in drug development of like this all hands on deck approach to experiencing the urgency that patients feel. Let's bring that to the drug development, to the device development, to really bring everybody together and let's get this done, because patients need these techniques, these technologies, and they need them now.
I think that's a really important point, like not being on the sideline, but being actively involved. But now it's not just the existing technologies, but it's completely new technologies that, some physicians may not even understand the underlying, computer science, because it's built by, domain experts in a completely different field. Have you witnessed sort of a sense of or witnessed sort of activities on that realm, whether is this just hype, or do you think sort of from a patient perspective, this is also something that is seen as an enabling technology?
I mean, I think that patients are extremely forward thinking when it comes to new technologies and information. I mean, we're living in a digital age where people are very accustomed to using their data. We use our Fitbit data that comes in, and people watch, monitor the number of steps that they take. So I think that patients are absolutely excited about new technologies and how we can use those to enable development, and also just, applied in our everyday medical care to facilitate better lives.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe I can bounce this quickly to add, there's obviously a distinction between counting steps and diagnosing cancer, but ultimately it's all devices, it's all data, they have to be interoperable. So on the one hand, there's that extreme possibility of innovation and cutting edge, forward thinking, while on the other hand, it also comes with risk. Do you mind briefly commenting on that before we move forward to Esther?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, actually, Joe. I mean, essentially, a lot of what we're talking about particularly within the context of this discussion and PICC, really comes down a lot to diagnosis. And the fundamentals for diagnosis aren't different, whether it's done by an algorithm or it's done by a microscope. You've got to understand the precision, the accuracy, et cetera, so I think we've got the framework that's actually already there. The trick really, I think, is making sure that we all do this together in a responsible way. And like I mentioned earlier on, take that journey together and things like that. But fundamentally, we're really talking about benefit risk, which is what the FDA, certainly within the CDRH context, determines the applicability to be allowed onto the market or not. And I think that we can get a very good handle on that as long as we start understanding that from day one, which is exactly what we're trying to do in this collaborative community. What are the benefits? I think we're all agreed that the increase in accuracy and specific diagnosis to allow better therapy is pretty clear. The risks, maybe we don't know quite so much at the moment, but as the field develops, we'll get a much better understanding of those risks. And I think that will help drive the whole field forward, so that as more devices are coming for approval or clearance through CDRH, we'll be able to do that in a much more efficient manner, and not be any sort of blockage to getting things out onto the market, because that's the last thing that we want to do. So really it comes down to that, can we understand benefit risk and really develop our understanding of that as we go forwards.
Perfect, thank you. Next in this panel is Esther Abels. She's the Chief Clinical and Regulatory Officer with Visiopharm, one of the leading image analytics companies. She's the co-founder of PICC and has decades of experience in the regulatory space. As part of her many functions, she's leading the payer work group in PICC. Pleasure to have you, Esther. So one of the key elements for full integration of new technologies is obviously achieving financial sustainability in clinical practice. Do you mind outlining this vast problem in a few minutes? And I know I'm asking for the impossible here.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And it's great to be here. It's my pleasure to be here. And first, let me start by saying I'm not an expert in reimbursement and payer strategies. Nevertheless, it was very early on that we identified that there is a challenge in digital pathology, which we definitely can call a vast problem. And it's a vast problem you cannot tackle easily. Even though I played rugby, it's hard to tackle that one. But through the sport, but also in my professional career, I learned that a challenge, a hurdle, an obstacle, you can overcome that by working collaboratively, joining efforts, combining domain knowledge, etc. And that's the reason why you and I kicked off this payer working group back in 2018. And we started a project and quickly gained momentum with a bunch of great people who all have different backgrounds, different domain experts, different domain knowledge, but we all have and we're facing the same challenge and the same goal. And that is, we want to overcome the hurdle of the digital pathology adoption to bringing that innovation to patients, to provide them with the right diagnosis at the right time to get the right treatments. So this working group started because we identified that this lack of clearly demonstrated added value of digital pathology is still continues to stall actually the larger clinical adoption. And the return on investment remains unclear. And also financially sustainability into clinical integration is lacking. And we found there is a disconnect between industry, researchers, payers, healthcare, etc., government, patients. Therefore, we identified we need more patient and outcome-centered studies that focus on the demonstration of added value. It's not new, this demand, but we recognize that existing efforts often ignore the patient, provider, and payer perspective. So that's why I'm also so happy that Friends of Cancer Research and Laura was taking great parts in this payer working group as well. And financial sustainability is one of the key, if not the key challenge that digital pathology has, and machine learning and AI applications in diagnostic pathology. And the return on investment for digital pathology has not been conclusively shown. We need to have definitive clinical outcomes and clinical utility data, and payers need that to have a justification for reimbursements. So yes, one would say there are already some existing reimbursement codes that can be used. And you can use them, of course, in digital pathology as well. And you can use all these different codes as usual. For example, if you review a case, you can apply the CPT codes that are currently existing, such as 88360. And there's also one for IHC image analysis. And it's great that we have these, but they do not account for all the costs that we're making, and not for the total value of digital pathology technologies that digital pathology is providing, actually. So to name a few of those values, it facilitates, and we already discussed it before, it facilitates uniformity, consistency diagnosis. It could improve the speed and reduce overall cost in diagnosis. It could reduce need for quality errors and reflex testing. So these benefits and the value are not yet covered by the technical and professional components together, but also they're not yet covered by using them alone. So what we're thinking with this working group is really to discuss this also with the AMA. And we had a meeting with them to identify whether we could also collaborate with them. And it was a great session where we also discussed that digital pathology has codes available, but they're only to a certain level. For example, the scanning of slides is not yet included as a procedural code. Analysis of general use cases or the hyperplexing cases that you currently see a lot of research that will probably pop up in diagnostic areas as well. So we could create new reimbursement code categories for these. And that's something that we try to accomplish with this group. And we're focusing on best practices to understand the coverage determination pathways and to drive towards a solution. So that's I really think, one of the next steps that we're working on to provide a comprehensive solution for all.
Oh, thank you. That's a comprehensive set of points to quickly reflect. So we heard the FDA perspective, the AI powering of diagnostics, the challenges and opportunities of interoperability, as well as the patient perspective, ultimately culminating in, this need for truly demonstrating clinical utility for achieving financial sustainability. So let's open up a round of quicker comments on this topic. So if we take that whole arc from collaborative community and the FDA reaching out all the way to payers, can I ask you for quick comments how you see how this synergy would ultimately help in accomplishing innovation?
Yeah.
Maybe we start. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. So I could think of that because of all these different experts and this collaborative community, especially also really thankful to the FDA of setting this up, because I do think that with all these different stakeholders in this reimbursement trajectory, you can perceive it from all the different angles. Every different stakeholder might look at it differently. Everybody has their own angle to it. For example, a pathologist will highly likely see the numerous benefits of digital pathology. And it has already been documented and shown in many studies. For example, recently I've read something about that 30% of the cases can be misdiagnosed to bad staining. And I think if we focus on pre-analytics, for example, that's also a working group, and how it could improve, for example, the interoperability with scanners and assays, then we aim at that aspect that it helps the pathologist in the end to get a better diagnosis. So I think looking at from the pathologist perspective, how they can review the slides, the whole slide images, for example, or if you look at it from the payers, they really look at the evidence of reduced cost and improved clinical outcomes. So what kind of evidence is that they would like to see in novel technologies and the clinical utility? So that's how I see that it really can bring value, and also with the discussions with the FDA collaborations there, it could really also help thinking how can you include this clinical utility in your regulatory path in getting devices cleared, taking into account the clinical utility, taking into account what would it take to generate that evidence, and use that also for your payers. So at the same time, you're running a parallel path, so to say. So speed up certain
Let me pick
items.
this up. Ed, what do you say from an FDA perspective to these points?
Thanks, Joe. I agree very much with what Esther said, and I think it reflects very much some of my earlier comments that clearly having collaborations on the early stage of technology development is absolutely vital. It's very easy to say, well, we're all on the same side and we've got to be doing the right things. But actually the important part for me is the specifics. The devil is always in the detail. If you have a complicated and novel technology, such as digital pathology and all of its different aspects, then there are so many places where technology can be advancing at an incredibly rapid rate. But the evaluation of those technologies, be it the way for assessing the safety and effectiveness of a technology, or even just data formats and things like that, the more complex and the more varieties, if you like, of those sorts of things that exist, the more complicated it is really to assess technology and develop it on a level playing field, which of course then translates eventually into the poor reviewers at FDA have to deal not just with the safety and effectiveness of a device, but also how good the testing methodologies are. And I think that complicates the whole thing. So the more that we can standardize these things with a small s, I think ultimately, as Esther said, patients will benefit.
That's a very good transition. Patient perspective. Laura, how did you reconcile these big components from collaborative community all the way to payer perspective? Where do you see the patients come into play here?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Absolutely. I mean, I think when we're thinking about development of a product all the way to, the establishment of a new field, patient perspective really has to be involved in that from every stage of the process. Because inherently, while all of the stakeholders involved, of course, their needs and what benefits them are going to be relatively aligned, as they should be, there's nuances and there's differences. And bringing patients into the conversation from the very beginning allows us to start to think about patient needs in the development process, in how we regulate, in how we pay or make payment decisions, because the benefit of the technology to a patient is going to be a little bit different. And that's going to dictate different outcomes and how we measure it differently and how we value it. And when I say value, I don't mean dollar signs, but how do we value the technology and its role in patients' lives? And so this is not something that we can come in at the end, but has to be involved from the very beginning and think about this as I often like to say, it's a holistic picture that we have to be creating from the very beginning.
It's a very, very important point when it comes to, the holistic picture. Maybe I turn to Marcus. You mentioned, again, the opportunities and challenges of interoperability, and that is a gigantic holistic picture when it comes to, what you outlined with 21st Century Cures Act, etc. Do you mind trying to fit this together in the challenging IT infrastructure and technology questions that we face today?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So I think the holistic approach is very important in that, and also picking up on what Ed and Esther said, I think there are lots of moving pieces. It's kind of like a multi-dimensional optimization problem that we're trying to solve all at once. There are a variety of different stakeholder groups involved that have different interests, different incentives, and also bring different expertise to the table. And I think with what we all realize is that these different components, or on the IT side systems, ultimately need to talk to each other, exchange information, and need to exchange information in a way that such that the downstream system is also able to interpret and use that information in a clinically meaningful way. And so I think as part of that process, we'll really need to consider the different perspectives that each of the different stakeholder groups bring into this and try to harmonize them early on. So for example, one example is that initially the FDA evaluated whole slide imaging systems end to end, from the image acquisition to the display of the image on the monitor, which from a risk perspective made a lot of sense initially to say, okay, we basically evaluate the entire pixel pathway to ensure that what ultimately is being displayed to a physician is actually correct. Now, once we move into a system where we have machine learning and AI and lots of different systems talking to each other, that approach becomes more and more cumbersome and ultimately also may represent a risk to patients from a very different perspective, in that it may be difficult to integrate a new technology that may really bring benefit to the diagnostic workflow or the treatment overall. So I think this is an aspect where bringing in a variety of different stakeholders through working groups as part of the alliance or collaborative community will be important to figure out what are actually the requirements of, let's say, an interface between different systems that need to exchange information with each other. And I think an important aspect to that is also that when we talk about standardization, it also has to be, to a certain extent, a democratic process where people will need to agree. So rarely it works that one individual group is just able to dictate how this is going to work. There were examples of this too. But I think now we are in a situation where imaging scanning manufacturers, regulatory experts, clinicians, AI researchers all need to come together and agree on what information will need to be included in a file, for example, when exchanged between a scanner and an ML system, and how should the results of such an ML system be displayed back to a clinician, or maybe what information should be contained so that it can be interpreted unambiguously in clinical context. And so I think these are some of the key challenges around that, where the holistic approach that was mentioned earlier and the collaboration is extremely important.
Matthew, these are all very abstract concepts. What do you think when it comes down to, the daily work of diagnosing cancer and diagnosing cancer, the talks that we started with? How do you see this interplay actually, be it holistic, be it financial, be it from a regulatory perspective? How do you see this actually shape day-to-day practice?
Yeah, so obviously I completely agree with everybody that this is or has to be an all hands on deck approach. I think with all the various organizations that have been approached and that are working towards kind of further understanding how all of these will interplay together, it is critical to get everybody's perspective. As we heard, there are so many different possibilities where machine learning can impact the pathologist field or the medical field in general. Whether it's increasing in accuracy or looking at it from an efficiency standpoint, or whether there's a discovery aspect from digital or novel digital biomarkers that can be generated. I think each of these will have to be looked at with a very much under the microscope, no pun intended, but at least being able to really go through each of them and understand all of their nuances and how they affect pathologists and the medical field in general. So I think there are a lot of variables at hand, but I think getting all of the relevant stakeholders, of course, as well as the regulatory bodies together, that we'll be able to figure it all out.
Wonderful. I think this is a fantastic summary of a very, very broad topic. And if I may requote that when we started, it was kind of the topic was artificial intelligence powered cancer diagnostics, how regulatory science can reshape digital diagnostics. I think we provided relatively holistic and hopefully value added approach to this very interesting topic. Thank you very much.